For most people, Antarctica is an abstraction, a white void at the bottom of the world, a place of maps and margins, a continent reduced to silence. But for scientists, Antarctica has always been something else entirely. It is not empty, it is not dead, and it is not quiet. Beneath kilometers of compressed ice lies a hidden landscape, ancient rock, subglacial lakes, slow-moving rivers of meltwater, and geothermal systems sealed away from sunlight for hundreds of thousands of years. A world untouched by human history, preserved in cold darkness. For decades, this buried environment has been studied indirectly, not by eyes but by instruments, by vibrations, by echoes, by the way energy moves through matter. Seismic arrays listen to the planet's pulse. Radar systems fire signals downward, waiting for reflections. Thermal satellites map heat signatures invisible to the naked eye. Normally, these tools tell a consistent story. Ice behaves like ice. Rock behaves like rock. Water behaves like water. Each layer returns a predictable response. Each boundary has a known signature. Deviations are rare, and when they occur, they usually have explanations rooted in geology, pressure, or temperature gradients. Until recently, the anomaly did not announce itself dramatically. There was no explosion, no visible rupture in the ice. It began as a statistical inconsistency. A cluster of seismic sensors, positioned thousands of kilometers apart, began recording rhythmic disturbances deep beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. Not sharp spikes like earthquakes, not random noise. Rhythms, low-frequency pulses repeating at regular intervals. At first, they were dismissed as instrumental interference, solar activity, calibration drift, background noise amplified by extreme conditions. But the pattern persisted. And more importantly, it appeared in multiple independent systems. When radar teams overlaid their penetration scans over the same coordinates, they noticed something else. The radar waves were returning too cleanly. In glaciology, clarity is suspicious. Ice scatters signals, rock diffuses them. Natural formations rarely create sharp, uniform reflections, but in this region, the radar echoes suggested boundaries that were smooth, deliberate, almost planar. As if the signals were striking surfaces not shaped by erosion, but by design. Then came the thermal data. Antarctica is cold, but it is not thermally uniform. Beneath the ice, geothermal heat leaks upward from Earth's interior, creating subtle variations. These are well mapped, well understood. Except here. At extreme depth, far below where geothermal models predict such behavior, satellites detected a stable heat source, not fluctuating, not spreading. Stable, contained. It was not hot enough to melt the ice above it completely, but it was warm enough to stand out like a heartbeat beneath a frozen chest. Individually, none of these readings proved anything. Together, they formed a shape, a convergence. And when the data sets were overlaid, seismic rhythm, radar geometry, thermal anomaly, they pointed to the same location. Deep beneath the ice. Too deep to reach easily. Too coherent to ignore. At this stage, no one used words like structure or object in official channels. The language remained cautious, almost aggressively neutral. Anomalous coherence. Unclassified subsurface response. Non-correlating thermal source. But behind closed doors, discussions changed tone. Because nature is chaotic. And this was not. The readings suggested boundaries with scale, width, height, depth, not precise measurements but enough to imply volume, enough to imply that whatever lay beneath the ice was not a point anomaly but something extensive, something large. Still, protocol demanded restraint. Before escalating, scientists cross-checked everything. They reviewed historical data, old seismic logs, archived radar scans from previous decades. That's when something unsettling emerged. The anomaly was not new. It had been there before, faintly, partially, barely noticeable beneath older, noisier instrumentation. The signals existed, but they had been below the threshold of concern, lost in static, written off as artifacts. Only now, with more sensitive equipment, had it become impossible to dismiss. Which raised an uncomfortable question. If it had always been there, why was it becoming more visible now? The answer may lie not in the anomaly itself, but in us. Human technology has grown louder, more invasive. Our instruments probe deeper, strike harder, listen more aggressively. What was once a whisper beneath the ice was now being actively interrogated. And something was responding. Not in a way that suggested movement. Not in a way that implied awakening. But in a way that suggested presence. At some point during this process, a decision was made to compile the findings into a preliminary internal document. Not a public announcement. Not a press release. A working report. It was intended for limited circulation, a technical summary meant to flag the anomaly for further evaluation. The language was deliberately restrained, every claim softened by probability, every interpretation wrapped in uncertainty. But even so, the implications were difficult to contain. The report described geometric consistency, inconsistent with known glacial or geological processes. It noted persistent thermal output unlinked to volcanic activity. It acknowledged repeating seismic oscillations with no clear natural driver. No conclusions were drawn. None were needed, because the absence of explanation spoke louder than any speculation. For reasons still unclear, that document did not remain internal. For a brief window of time, a matter of hours, it appeared in an online scientific repository used for data sharing between institutions. There was no announcement, no indexing, no spotlight, just a file quietly accessible to anyone who knew where to look. And then it vanished. But before it disappeared, a handful of people saw it. Some downloaded it. Some archived fragments. Some read it and immediately understood that it was not supposed to be there. Those people noticed something else. The report had gaps. Sections marked for data that were missing. References to appendices that did not exist, phrases that seemed to stop short of saying what the numbers implied, as if the authors themselves were hesitating, or being cautious beyond scientific norms. Within hours, attempts to access the document returned errors, not file removed, not access denied. Just absence, the kind that suggests something was not merely hidden, but erased. No explanation followed. No clarification. No denial. And in the weeks that came after, the Antarctic continent itself seemed to close ranks. Research zones quietly reclassified. Flight paths adjusted. Satellite feeds reduced in resolution or delayed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would attract headlines. Just enough to ensure that whatever lay beneath that ice would remain unseen. For now, because if there is one thing history teaches us, it is this. When silence follows discovery, it is rarely because nothing was found. The document was never meant to be definitive. It carried no bold conclusions, no dramatic language, no declarations of discovery. In fact, if someone unfamiliar with the context had skimmed it quickly, they might have missed its significance entirely. It read like what it was labeled to be, a preliminary technical assessment, dry, careful, restrained. But within scientific circles, restraint can be more alarming than certainty. The report opened with a summary of instrumentation correlations, seismic, radar, and thermal, all independently flagging the same subsurface region. The authors emphasized uncertainty at every turn, repeatedly noting limitations in resolution, signal interference, and the need for further verification. And yet, despite this caution, certain phrases stood out. Geometric regularity exceeding expected natural variance. Thermal stability inconsistent with modeled geothermal dispersion. Persistent oscillatory signals lacking identifiable geophysical source. These were not casual observations. They were warnings. The document avoided speculative terminology entirely. There was no mention of structures, constructions, or artificiality, but the data was laid out clearly enough that any experienced analyst could draw their own conclusions. Especially in the appendix, or what was supposed to be the appendix. Several references pointed towards supplementary figures and extended datasets that were not included in the file. The text cited diagrams, depth cross-sections, and spectral analyses that simply were not there. At first glance, this could be explained as a clerical error, an incomplete upload, a versioning mistake. But the more one read, the harder that explanation became to accept. The missing sections were not random. They clustered around the most sensitive interpretations. Where the language became most evasive, the data vanished entirely, as if someone had deliberately stripped the report down to its least dangerous form. Those who accessed the document during its brief availability noticed another detail that felt out of place. The authorship. Instead of individual researchers, the report listed institutional affiliations only. No names, no contact points, no corresponding author. In large collaborations, anonymity is not unheard of, but total omission is rare. Someone always signs. Someone always takes responsibility. Here, no one did. Even more unusual was the timestamp. The document appeared in the repository with a creation time that did not match its upload window. Metadata suggested it had been compiled days earlier, possibly weeks, and only made visible briefly before being pulled, which raised an unsettling possibility. The report had existed quietly, internally, for some time, and its sudden appearance online may not have been accidental. Within hours of its disappearance, internal links began breaking across related databases. Citation references that once resolved to valid entries now returned generic error messages. Automated systems seemed to forget that the document had ever existed. This kind of erasure is not typical. Scientific records are redundant by design. Mirrors, backups, caches. Once something enters the system, traces usually remain. Here, traces were actively removed. Those who attempted to retrieve cached versions noticed inconsistencies. Different mirrors returned different error codes. Some claimed the file never existed. Others suggested it had been replaced. Replaced by what exactly was never clarified. And perhaps most telling of all, no institution issued a denial. There was no statement explaining that the report was inaccurate. No clarification labeling it as preliminary or flawed. No reassurance to calm speculation. Just silence. In environments where reputation and credibility matter deeply, silence is costly. It invites questions. It fuels curiosity, which suggests that speaking would have been worse. Behind the scenes, subtle shifts began to occur. Researchers who had been loosely associated with Antarctic subsurface studies suddenly became unreachable. Email auto-replies cited extended fieldwork, unavailable communications, or administrative leave. Some profiles were quietly removed from institutional websites. Others remained, but stopped updating publications. Grant databases showed projects being restructured. Timelines extended indefinitely. objectives reworded to exclude deep subsurface analysis. None of this was announced. None of it was explained. It simply happened. Those familiar with bureaucratic systems recognize this pattern. When something is deemed sensitive, overt shutdowns draw attention. Quiet reallocation achieves the same result without headlines. And attention clearly was not desired. Meanwhile, independent observers began noticing anomalies of their own. Civilian satellite imagery platforms, which normally provide near real-time updates of polar regions, showed delays or resolution drops over specific Antarctic coordinates. Not the entire continent, just narrow bands. When questioned, providers cited routine maintenance, calibration issues, or data prioritization for climate modeling. All plausible, all unprovable. Yet the timing aligned too neatly with the disappearance of the report to ignore. Even atmospheric data appeared affected. Certain high-altitude measurements over the region showed gaps, balloons diverted, flights rerouted. Again, nothing dramatic. Just absence. And absence, in this case, became a presence of its own. A handful of analysts attempted to reconstruct the missing data using older archives and indirect sources. They overlaid historical radar scans, seismic noise maps, and geothermal models. What they found was not definitive, but it was suggestive. The anomaly had not grown. It had not shifted. It had remained stable. For something buried beneath a dynamic ice sheet, stability is unusual. Ice moves, pressure changes, thermal gradients fluctuate. But this feature persisted with remarkable consistency, which raised a disturbing idea. If the anomaly was not reacting to the environment, perhaps the environment was reacting to it. At no point did anyone claim the anomaly was alive, or active, or intelligent. Those words belong to speculation, not science. But even within the cautious language of the report, one implication lingered unspoken. This was not a random formation. The report's conclusion section was the most heavily edited. Sentences trailed off. Paragraphs ended abruptly. Recommendations were vague to the point of uselessness. Instead of proposing further study, the document suggested interdisciplinary review and restricted data handling protocols. In other words, escalation. And escalation, in institutional terms, means transfer of authority. Once a subject crosses certain thresholds, it moves out of academic hands and into administrative or governmental ones. That transition is rarely visible from the outside, but its effects are unmistakable. Funding disappears. Access narrows. Silence spreads. For the few who had read the report, the most unsettling aspect was not what it said, but what it avoided saying. There were no attempts to explain the anomaly as a sensor glitch, no comforting references to rare but natural geological phenomena, no hand-waving. Instead, the report treated the data as real, unexplained, and serious. And then it vanished, which leaves us with an uncomfortable possibility. The report may not have been removed because it was wrong. It may have been removed because it was right, or close enough to something that authorities were not ready to address publicly. In such cases, delay is strategy. Time allows for containment, for narrative shaping, for decisions to be made behind closed doors. Because once the idea enters public consciousness that something exists beneath the Antarctic ice, something vast, coherent, and unknown, it cannot be easily removed. And perhaps that is why the silence that followed felt so heavy. Because silence is not emptiness. It is pressure. And pressure over time always seeks release. Changes rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, embedded in procedure. A form adjusted, A protocol revised. A request delayed. After the disappearance of the report, the Antarctic research ecosystem did not shut down. That would have been noticeable, suspicious. Instead, it subtly reoriented. The first signs were administrative. Permits that had once been approved in weeks began taking months. Some applications were returned with vague notes requesting additional clarification. Others were quietly denied without explanation, citing shifting priorities or logistical constraints. On paper, nothing seemed extraordinary. But when mapped over time, a pattern emerged. Projects involving deep ice radar, long-duration seismic arrays, high-resolution subsurface modeling, all slowed, all redirected, all softened. Researchers were encouraged to focus on surface-level climate metrics, atmospheric sampling, and biodiversity near coastal zones. Important work, certainly, necessary, but safer, far from the depths. At the same time, access classifications across parts of the continent changed. Zones that had once been shared between multiple international teams were quietly reassigned to narrower oversight structures. This was not unprecedented. Antarctica is governed by treaties, not borders, and access is always fluid. But the speed of the reclassification was unusual, and the locations were specific. They overlapped almost perfectly with the coordinates referenced in the missing report. Logistics followed classification. Flights began a shift. Not canceled, rerouted. Aircraft that once passed over certain regions now altered course by subtle margins. Fuel justifications were cited, weather modeling, air traffic coordination. Each explanation, taken alone, made sense. Together, they formed a quiet perimeter. Observers tracking air traffic data noticed an increase in heavy-lift cargo flights during periods that did not align with standard research seasons. These aircraft were not typical scientific transports. Their flight profiles suggested equipment movement rather than personnel rotation. Again, not proof, but suggestive. Satellite imagery added another layer. Commercial providers noticed that certain high-resolution datasets over parts of Antarctica were delayed, blurred, or delivered with reduced fidelity. Public explanations referenced calibration cycles and resource allocation. But calibration does not usually target geographic specificity. Yet here, the same regions appeared repeatedly. And then there was the silence. Researchers known for their openness stopped publishing interim findings. Conferences passed without mention of subsurface Antarctic anomalies. Panels that once speculated freely now avoided the topic entirely. When asked directly, responses were polite but non-committal. We don't have anything conclusive. The data is under review. It's too early to say. Always early. Always inconclusive. As weeks turned into months, something else became apparent. No one was challenging the silence. In academic environments, suppression tends to provoke resistance. Whistleblowers, leaks, anonymous disclosures. Here there were none, which implies something important. Either the number of people with direct access to the full data was extremely small, or those who had access understood the consequences of speaking, or both. Behind the scenes, international coordination appeared to intensify. Meetings between Antarctic Treaty members increased in frequency, though agendas remained classified. Language in public summaries emphasized infrastructure resilience and risk mitigation. Vague terms, flexible enough to mean anything. At the same time, funding flowed. Not into public research grants, but into logistical and monitoring capabilities. New sensor deployments were authorized, but their specifications were not shared openly. These were not exploratory instruments. They were surveillance grade. designed not to discover something new, but to watch something already known. And watching implies expectation. Perhaps the most telling change was the shift in narrative framing. Antarctica began appearing in policy discussions not just as a climate indicator, but as a strategic asset. Language borrowed from defense analysis began to surface: stability, security, containment. Words rarely used in reference to ice and penguins. All of this occurred without public debate, which is significant, because secrecy at this scale requires coordination across nations with competing interests. Agreement is rare. Fear, however, is universal. At some point, a decision must have been made that whatever lay beneath the ice was not merely a scientific curiosity. It was something that needed to be managed, contained, perhaps even protected from us or for us. Speculation began to circulate in private channels. Not wild theories, not extraterrestrial fantasies, but cautious questions. What if the anomaly was artificial but ancient? What if it predated modern civilization, even humanity itself? What if it had been dormant, inert, or simply irrelevant until now? Human activity has accelerated dramatically in recent decades. Deep Earth probing, nuclear testing, planetary-scale communication networks. We have become loud. If something had been designed to remain hidden beneath the ice, Antarctica would have been the perfect place. Stable, isolated, shielded from tectonic chaos. But nothing remains hidden forever, especially not from a species that measures, scans, and drills everything it touches. Which raises another question. If authorities moved so quickly to restrict access, reduce visibility, and control data, what were they afraid of? Not discovery, because discovery had already occurred. Perhaps reaction. Perhaps consequences. Because some things, once acknowledged publicly, cannot be unacknowledged. They change context. They shift perception. They force answers where none exist. Better then to slow the process, to keep the anomaly framed as under investigation, to delay interpretation. Time, after all, is the most effective containment strategy. And yet, time has a way of exposing patterns. Independent analysts continued watching from the outside, tracking what little data remained accessible, comparing new gaps with old records. They noticed something subtle but unsettling. The anomaly's signal profile began to sharpen. Not stronger, not larger, clearer, as if noise around it was being filtered out. This could be explained by improved instrumentation, better processing, more focused analysis. Or it could suggest something else, that the thing beneath the ice was not changing, but our relationship to it was. The more we constrained observation, the more defined it became in what little remained visible. Like an object emerging from fog as everything else fades. At no point did anyone report movement. No shifts in position. No expansion. No structural deformation. Which paradoxically made it more unsettling. Because geological formations change. Ice flows. Pressure reshapes cavities. This did not. It simply endured. And endurance implies intention only if intention exists. But science does not deal in intention. It deals in patterns. And the pattern by now was undeniable. Something had been found beneath the Antarctic ice. Something large. Something coherent. Something stable. And instead of opening that discovery to the world had quietly looked away. Not because it wasn't important, but because it might have been too important. Because some discoveries do not add to human knowledge. They redefine it. Long before Antarctica was understood as a continent of ice, It existed in the human imagination as something else. Not a blank space, not a frozen void, but an unknown land at the edge of the world. Ancient maps, drawn centuries before modern exploration, depicted a southern continent with coastlines, rivers, and interior features that should not have been visible beneath ice. These maps were often dismissed as speculative, symbolic, or inaccurate. And perhaps many of them were. But some details remain difficult to explain. Certain pre-modern cartographic records show Antarctica without its ice cover, or partially exposed. The coastlines align uncannily well with what modern ice-penetrating radar has since revealed beneath kilometers of ice. This does not mean ancient civilizations visited Antarctica in the modern sense, but it does suggest that knowledge of the continent, or something like it, existed earlier than we are comfortable admitting. Over time, these maps were reclassified as curiosities, artifacts of imagination, errors layered upon errors. History, after all, prefers clean timelines. Yet exploration accounts from the early modern era complicate this narrative further. Several expeditions reported phenomena that did not fit the idea of a lifeless frozen desert: warm air currents emerging from the ground, steam rising through cracks in the ice, cavernous openings where temperatures were unexpectedly stable. At the time, these accounts were treated as exaggerations, misinterpretations caused by exhaustion or extreme conditions. Today, we know better. Beneath Antarctica exists one of the largest hidden hydrological systems on Earth. Hundreds of subglacial lakes, rivers flowing under pressure, cavern networks warmed by geothermal heat. Some of these caverns are vast, cathedral-like spaces sealed away from the surface for geological timescales. And some display features that challenge easy explanation. Researchers who have studied ice-free cave systems beneath volcanic regions of Antarctica have noted walls that appear unnaturally smooth, not polished by water, not fractured by tectonic stress. Smooth in a way that implies precision. In isolation, such formations can be explained as rare natural processes: lava tubes, thermal erosion, pressure differentials. But when these reports are compared with radar anomalies detected elsewhere on the continent, a pattern begins to emerge. Geometry, repeated right angles, consistent planar surfaces, symmetry where randomness should dominate. These are not conclusions. They are observations, and observations demand context. Which brings us back to the present. The anomaly beneath the ice does not exist in a vacuum. It exists within a landscape that has long defied simplistic understanding. Antarctica has not always been frozen. Geological evidence confirms that it once supported forests, rivers, and a temperate climate. This was not millions of years ago in some distant epoch, but within a timescale that overlaps with early hominid development. When Antarctica froze, it did so rapidly. Ice does not just destroy, it preserves. Anything sealed beneath it becomes isolated from time. This raises an unsettling possibility. If a structure, artificial or otherwise, existed before the ice formed, Antarctica would have become the perfect vault. No erosion, no weathering, no human interference. Just pressure, darkness, and silence. Over thousands of years, civilizations rose and fell elsewhere on the planet. Knowledge was lost, languages vanished, entire cultures disappeared without trace. But beneath the Antarctic ice, something could remain exactly as it was left. Waiting is perhaps the wrong word. Preserved is more accurate. Ancient myths, often dismissed as metaphor, also take on new resonance in this context. Stories of watchers placed at the edges of the world, of knowledge sealed away until humanity was ready, of gods or guardians who did not rule, but observed. These narratives appear across cultures that never interacted. This does not prove anything, but it suggests a shared intuition, a sense that not all intelligence, not all agency, announces itself through dominance or presence. Some things remain distant, hidden, patient. Modern science rarely entertains such ideas for good reason. Evidence matters. And yet, evidence does not always speak loudly. Sometimes it whispers. The anomaly beneath the ice does not broadcast signals. It does not emit energy indiscriminately. It does not disrupt its surroundings. It simply exists. And perhaps it always has. Which raises another question. If this structure is ancient, who built it? Not necessarily extraterrestrials. That assumption often distracts more than it clarifies. The universe is vast, but Earth itself has a deep and largely unexplored history. Advanced does not mean alien. It may mean forgotten, or incompatible with the narratives we tell ourselves about progress and linear development. The idea that humanity is the first technological civilization on Earth is comforting. It places us at the pinnacle. But comfort is not evidence. There is no rule that says intelligence arises only once. No law that prevents technological development from collapsing and leaving behind traces too subtle to survive erosion, except where erosion does not reach. Like beneath kilometers of ice, the structure suggested by Antarctic data does not resemble a city. There are no indications of habitation, roads, or sprawl. It resembles something else. An installation, a node, a site built for a purpose other than living. And that purpose may not require activity. It may require only endurance, observation, or containment. Some theorists have proposed that the structure could be a repository, a storage site for information or materials meant to persist beyond civilizations. Others suggest it could be a monitoring system, not active in the way machines are active, but responsive when certain thresholds are crossed. Like a sensor waiting for a signal. If so, humanity's growing technological footprint may have finally crossed that threshold. Not intentionally, not knowingly, but inevitably. Every species that gains the ability to probe the planet eventually probes too deeply. The question is not whether we would find something. It is whether we would recognize it when we did, and whether those who recognized it first would choose to tell the rest of us. Because ancient evidence does not demand belief. It demands humility. It asks us to consider that our understanding of Earth's history may be incomplete, that not all chapters are written in stone and bone. Some are written in ice, and ice does not forget.